Thank you, Senator Courson. Thank you, Senator McElveen, for hosting us this morning, and good morning, everyone else. I'm going to be brief in introducing our next speaker and the next topic, which involves two federal proposals to allow for seismic testing and offshore oil and gas development off the coast of South Carolina and our three neighboring southeastern states. We're not asking for the Senate to do anything right now. We want you to be aware of the potential consequences of these proposals if they were to be finalized, which they haven't yet, and be prepared to potentially respond if the opportunity arrives. What I hope you'll get from our next speaker is some sense of the local opposition that has arisen over the last couple of years in response to these proposals at the local level, town councils, county councils, businesses, citizens, elected officials like Senator Campson, as well as some of our congressional delegation like Mark Sanford, have all spoken loudly and eloquently against these proposals. And I think our speaker this morning was chosen because he is in the middle of that local opposition. Mayor Pat O'Neill from Sullivan's Island has been in South Carolina for 30 years. His day job is at MUSC, where he's a professor and a director. And he came to South Carolina from Louisiana, so he's got firsthand experience of living alongside the oil and gas industry. And I'm going to invite him up here now to speak about that experience and what Sullivan's Island and other South Carolina coastal communities are actually concerned about. Mayor.
Mayor, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Mayor, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to visit with all of you this morning. I appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedules. I'd like to thank personally Senator Campson, my senator, for his consistent and very effective environmental leadership for many, many years. As was mentioned, I am the mayor of Sullivan's Island, formerly Moultrieville, many moons ago. And we are one of 24 local governments that have passed resolutions voicing our strong opposition to the efforts or the initiative to have offshore drilling and prior to that, offshore seismic testing to supposedly determine whether there's oil out there and gas reserves to be drilled. I think this demonstrates the range of concern about this all up and down the coast. Again, this is at least 24 local governments, and we've also been grateful to see the opposition to the offshore testing and drilling from people such as Senator Campson and such as Congressman Sanford. Sullivan's Island itself has a very long and deep history of environmental concern and the support for the environmental ethic. We sit right across the water from Morris Island and from Fort Sumter. We are a very unique island for the South Carolina coast in that we're, rather than eroding, we're actually accreting. And my predecessors, long before I was involved in town government, did something very wise and very brave. And that's that they put the land that was developing, which belongs to the town, this land that was accreting, under strong conservation protections through deed restrictions with the Low Country Open Land Trust. So we now have approximately 200 acres of beachfront land right across the harbor from Charleston that cannot be developed. So I think it's easy to see from that we put our money where our mouth is when it comes to environmental protection. As was mentioned, I grew up in South Louisiana and got to, as you can imagine from looking at me, that was a while back, but it was during part of the heyday of offshore drilling in Louisiana. The offshore oil and gas industry in Louisiana probably got its biggest start around the 1930s, at a time when the state had truly desperate needs for jobs. Very poor, were not very many opportunities for jobs in South Louisiana. In particular, if you weren't out there working in sugarcane fields, you were probably out in the swamps and marshes trapping muskrat and mink and anything else that you could capture and sell. But the prospects were not terribly good for most of the people there until the oil and gas industry came in. And clearly, it brought with it thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs which were desperately needed. I don't think there was any understanding at the time of the price that would ultimately be paid for those jobs. But we certainly can see it now when we look at the consequences of that industry and that activity on South Louisiana. I'd like to talk about, from those two vantage points, I'd like to talk about three primary issues that lead us to oppose the offshore seismic testing and potential drilling and exploration. The first is the seismic testing itself. This is not my area of expertise by any means, but I'm told that there have been very large numbers of marine scientists who have the expertise, who have stated unequivocally that the effects of the repeated, widespread, comprehensive fanning out across the ocean with these giant air guns emitting shock waves every few minutes, I imagine, will have potentially devastating consequences on marine life, on the marine mammals and fish in the ocean. It can disrupt their navigation, it can disrupt their mating, it can disrupt their efforts to find food. So basically, it potentially could get in the way of everything all of those species need to do to survive and to thrive. I don't need to tell you what a large industry the offshore fishing, both for sport and commercial fishing, is for South Carolina. It's a very important industry that just from the testing potentially could be threatened or damaged. One of the things to remember about the testing is that it'll be done by a number of companies, none of whom have any obligation to release their data to the people of the state or the people of surrounding states. So there's a possibility of wreaking havoc on the marine life that's out there to find data that will never be released. That's one big problem. Second problem is the obvious in light of the relatively recent BP spill in the Gulf, and that's the likelihood or the possibility of oil spills. As I think about Sullivan's Island and our 200 acres that we've preserved in a very natural state, and try to picture tar balls coming up on that, or on Senator Campson's beaches on the Isle of Palms, or on Edisto, or Hilton Head, or Myrtle Beach, it really sends a chill through me. And if you can imagine the consequences that that might have on our really important tourism industry, you can see that that could have very, very negative consequences on the entire state. We saw what happened with the BP spill as far as tourism in Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and the Gulf Coast of Florida. Had a real impact. It had a tremendous impact on the fisheries industries of all those states. There were more than 200 million gallons of oil that were released into the Gulf and spread out over more than 1,000 miles of coastline. That obviously is a worst case scenario, and you could say, well, that's a once-in-a-lifetime situation. I certainly hope it is, but we also hope the recent flooding was a once-in-a-lifetime situation. We don't know when the next disaster, the next accident could occur. And certainly, if you're working a mile or two under the surface of the water, nothing is foolproof in any way, shape, or form. The third problem with offshore exploration and drilling is one that Senator Campson has really done a fine job of publicizing to raise the public's awareness. The threat of an oil spill, particularly a severe oil spill, is probability. The potential impact from the infrastructure necessary to support offshore drilling is a dead certainty. You don't just have a couple of rigs that are out in the middle of the ocean and no impact on land. There's a tremendous amount of support infrastructure that has to be built, and that can cause a tremendous disruption on the things which we currently have in place along the South Carolina coast. I would invite you to go to Google Earth and do sort of a flyover over the Gulf Coast, starting in Louisiana around Grand Isle and heading west, and you'll see the tremendous amount of acreage that's given over to basically industrial wasteland that's necessary to support a successful offshore drilling industry. There's one in particular I would urge you to Google, and that is Port Fourchon, F-O-U-R-C-H-O-N. This is very close to Grand Isle, Louisiana, and it's right in the middle of the marsh, which is rapidly receding. But in the middle of all this natural marsh, you'll see an area the size of Sullivan's Island that is strictly the industrial backup area for support for the offshore rigs in that part of the Gulf of Mexico. You can multiply that many, many times to to imagine what's supporting the entirety of the offshore drilling industry throughout southwest Louisiana and into Texas. I don't know where you would put that in South Carolina. I don't know where you could put that where it would not really disrupt the environment, disrupt the functioning of our coastal communities, and disrupt the coastal economy, particularly with respect to tourism. So I would urge you to remember these three threats: the threat to marine life from the seismic testing, the possibility of significant oil spills and tremendous environmental damage, and the certainty of disruption from the necessary support infrastructure. And remember those three consequences of any offshore efforts off of South Carolina, and I would ask you to please do anything that you can to prevent this from happening. Thank you.
Mayor, thank you for your presentation. It was well received, and I think that thank you also for the coastal communities taking a stand against this. Many of us who are elected officials who do not represent the coastal areas are also opposed to offshore drilling in South Carolina. It just doesn't make sense, particularly if one looks at the fact that economic and environmental interests are interlocked in South Carolina and totally interlocked. So I thank you for your excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Mr. Campson.
Real briefly, Mayor, thank you for your presentation, and I didn't realize until we started having discussions about this issue that you did actually grow up in Louisiana. And I spent a lot of time in Louisiana because I've built 2 boats in the Gulf of Mexico, 2 passenger boats, and brought them back to Charleston and across the Gulf of Mexico. And the last point is a point that is totally left out of this debate, but it's really the most significant argument against offshore drilling off of South Carolina, because when I brought boats out of Morgan City, Louisiana, across the Gulf of Mexico, and out through the bayous of Louisiana back to Charleston, it is astounding the land-based infrastructure necessary to support offshore drilling. And really, the fact is, what's happened in South Carolina is we've already committed our coastal property to land uses that are incompatible with that type of industrialization. I mean, where are you going to put? Go to Google Earth and look at Port Fourchon, look at Deer Park, Texas, look at Morgan City, Louisiana, look at the tank farms, the laydown yards, the boat yards, everything necessary to support this industry, and ask yourself, are we going to put this in Murrells Inlet? Are we going to put it at Sullivan's Island? Or are we going to put it in Winyah Bay or the Ace Basin? There's just no place for it. So that's really a very important factor for all of us to consider as policymakers.
Mayor, again, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.